Welcome. Today, we travel back more than 5,000 years to a time before the pyramids, before the great temples of Karnak, before Egypt was even Egypt. We journey to the dawn of history itself, to uncover the mystery of a king whose name was written not in hieroglyphs, but in the image of a scorpion. Settle in. Let the weight of the day dissolve like footprints in the desert wind. Breathe deeply, and let us begin. In the winter of 1897, two German archaeologists named Emil Brugsch and Friedrich Kabe made their way through the drifting sands of Upper Egypt. They were working at the site of Hierakonpolis, the ancient city of the falcon god Horus, where generations of early Egyptian rulers had built their tombs and temples. The site had already yielded remarkable discoveries. The famous Narmer palette, which showed the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, had been found there just a few years earlier. But Brugsch and Kabe were about to find something stranger. Buried in a small tomb, among the rubble of centuries, they uncovered a series of broken artifacts. Pottery vessels, stone maces, fragments of ceremonial objects. Most were unremarkable, the usual detritus of ancient royal burials. But one object stopped them cold. It was a mace head, carved from limestone, about 8 inches across. Such objects were used in religious ceremonies, their rounded ends symbolizing the king's power to strike down enemies. But this mace head was covered with scenes carved in low relief. And at the center of those scenes stood a figure wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. Next to the figure was a symbol, a rosette, and beside it, the image of a scorpion. The Scorpion King had entered history. For decades, Egyptologists debated what to make of the discovery. Some dismissed the scorpion symbol as a mere emblem, not a name at all. Others argued the mace head depicted a king whose name had been lost, and the scorpion was simply a decorative element. But as more artifacts emerged from the sands of Egypt, a pattern began to take shape. There was not just one scorpion king. There were two. The first scorpion, whom scholars now call Scorpion I, emerged from the desert in the 1980s, nearly a century after the Hierakonpolis discovery. German archaeologists excavating at Abydos, the sacred city of Osiris, found something extraordinary in the desert cemetery known as Amel Kab. They were digging in an area called Cemetery U, a sprawling complex of tombs dating to the very beginning of Egyptian history. The tombs here were simple things, rectangular pits lined with mud brick, roofed with wooden beams and matting. But one tomb, designated UJ, was different. It was larger than the others. Much larger. 12 chambers arranged around a central burial, filled with objects of astonishing wealth. Imported pottery from Palestine, a ceremonial scepter of ivory, and hundreds of jars that had once contained wine and beer for the king's journey to the afterlife. The tomb dated to approximately 3250 BCE, 3 centuries before the first dynasty. And in that tomb, the excavators found something that changed everything. Tags. Hundreds of tiny bone and ivory tags, each about an inch long, inscribed with symbols. These were the earliest examples of writing ever found in Egypt, predating the better-known hieroglyphs by generations. And on many of these tags, carved into the ancient bone, was the image of a scorpion. Scorpion I had left his name for archaeologists to find 5,000 years later. The tags were inventory labels, recording the contents of jars and boxes placed in the tomb. They showed that this king controlled extensive trade networks, importing goods from as far away as the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. They showed that he commanded scribes who could write, administrators who could organize, and craftsmen who could create objects of remarkable sophistication. His tomb at Abydos was larger than any royal tomb that would be built for the next 300 years. He was, quite clearly, a king of kings, a ruler whose power extended over all of Upper Egypt and beyond. But his name was not included in any later king list. The Egyptians had forgotten him, or chosen to forget him, erasing the scorpion from the memory of the very civilization he helped create. Then there was Scorpion II, the king on the Hierakonpolis mace head. He ruled perhaps a century later, around 3150 BCE, in the generation immediately before the unification of Egypt under King Narmer. His tomb has never been definitively identified, though some archaeologists believe it may lie somewhere in the desert at Abydos, waiting to be found. The mace head shows him performing the same rituals that later pharaohs would perform for 3,000 years. He stands before the gods, wearing the white crown. He holds a hoe, ceremonially cutting the first sod for an irrigation canal, a king providing for his people, ensuring the floods would bring life to the fields. Above his head, prisoners are suspended from poles, enemies of Egypt who have been defeated and will serve as examples to any who might challenge his rule. This was a king at the height of his power, ruling just before the moment when Egypt would be united into a single nation. Yet his name, like that of his predecessor, was erased from history. Why? The period between roughly 3300 and 3100 BCE is one of the most mysterious in Egyptian history. Archaeologists call it the proto-dynastic period, or Dynasty Zero, a time when Egypt was not yet unified, when multiple kings ruled in different cities along the Nile, competing for resources, territory, and ultimately, supremacy. Hierakonpolis in the south was one center of power. This city, dedicated to the falcon god Horus, would eventually give rise to the kings who unified Egypt. But in the time of the Scorpions, it was one among several. Thynis, near Abydos, was another. Nakada, further north, was a third. Each had its own ruler, its own gods, its own ambitions. The Scorpion kings appear to have ruled from Abydos, the city that would later become the cult center of Osiris, god of the dead. Their tombs in the desert at Kab, the mother of pots, as the Arabs called it, would become the model for the royal burials of the first dynasty. Every pharaoh from Narmer through the second dynasty would be buried in that same cemetery, close to the Scorpions who had come before. But when those later kings compiled their official histories, they left the Scorpions out. The king lists that survive, the Palermo stone, the Turin canon, the lists of Abydos and Karnak, all begin with Menes, the legendary unifier of Egypt, or with Narmer, the king archaeologists now believe was the historical Menes. Before them, only gods and semi-mythical ancestors rule. The Scorpions were real. Their tombs are real. Their names are real, carved in bone and stone for archaeologists to find 5 millennia later. But they were not included in the official story. Why? Perhaps the answer lies in the nature of Egyptian kingship itself. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler. He was Horus incarnate, the living embodiment of divine kingship on earth. His legitimacy came from his connection to the gods, from the unbroken chain of succession stretching back to the dawn of time. To acknowledge that there had been kings before that unbroken chain, kings who were not part of the divine lineage, would be to question the very foundation of pharaonic power. The Scorpions were ancestors, yes. But they were ancestors from a time before order had fully triumphed over chaos, before Egypt had been unified under the double crown. They belonged to the age of the gods, the time of beginnings, when the rules were different and the kings were not quite human. Better to leave them out. Better to begin the story with Menes, with Narmer, with the moment when Upper and Lower Egypt became one. That was a clean story, a clear story, a story that served the needs of the priests and kings who told it. The Scorpions faded into myth. The symbol of the scorpion itself holds clues to the mystery. In Egyptian writing, the scorpion glyph represented the sound, Srkt, part of the name of the goddess Serket, the scorpion goddess who protected the dead and guarded the organs of the body in their canopic jars. But in the proto-dynastic period, writing was still in its infancy. Symbols had not yet settled into fixed meanings. Was the scorpion a name, a title, or something else entirely? Some scholars argue that the scorpion was not a personal name at all, but a royal title, perhaps, the stinging one, a reference to the king's power to strike down his enemies. Others suggest it was the name of a clan or tribal group, a way of identifying which family the king belonged to. Still others propose that the scorpion was a symbol of the goddess Serket, indicating that the king served as her earthly representative. But the discovery of Scorpion Eye's tomb at Abydos, with its dozens of scorpion labels, strongly suggests that the symbol functioned as a personal name. The king was called Scorpion. That was how he identified himself, how his scribes recorded his possessions, how he wished to be remembered. The choice of such a name tells us something about the man and his time. The scorpion is a dangerous creature, small but deadly, capable of killing creatures many times its size. For a king ruling in an age of constant warfare, when rivals lurked in every neighboring city and the desert tribes pressed against the settled lands of the Nile, the scorpion was an apt symbol. It said, "I may be small among the great powers of the world, but I am deadly. Cross me, and you will feel my sting." The scorpion also had positive associations. In the desert, where scorpions thrived, the creature represented survival, adaptation, mastery of harsh environments. A king who could control the scorpion's power was a king who could protect his people from the dangers that surrounded them. The scorpion kings ruled at a time of transformation. The irrigation systems that would make Egypt the granary of the ancient world were being developed. Writing was being invented. The first cities were rising along the Nile. Trade routes were reaching across the desert and across the sea, bringing new ideas and new technologies from Mesopotamia and the Levant. In that moment of flux, when the old ways were dying and the new had not yet fully arrived, the scorpion was a fitting emblem for rulers who stood at the threshold of history. So what became of the scorpion kings? Scorpion I died around 3250 BCE and was buried in his great tomb at Abydos, surrounded by the wealth he had accumulated in life, the wine and beer that would sustain him in the next world, the labels recording his name for eternity. His successors continued to rule from Abydos for another century, gradually expanding their control over the surrounding regions. Scorpion II ruled around 3150 BCE, at the very end of the proto-dynastic period. His mace head from Hierakonpolis shows him performing the rituals of kingship that would endure for 3,000 years. He may have been the immediate predecessor of Narmer, the king who finally unified Egypt and established the first dynasty. If so, then Scorpion II was the last king of the old order, the final ruler of the age before unification. His son, or his successor, would become the first pharaoh of a united Egypt, the founder of a dynasty that would last for centuries. And in the process, the Scorpion kings were quietly erased from the official record. But they were not entirely forgotten. The later Egyptians remembered the scorpion as a symbol of royal power, of protective force. The goddess Serket remained important throughout Egyptian history, guarding the dead and watching over the canopic jars that held the viscera of the deceased. And at Abydos, the desert cemetery where the scorpion kings were buried became the most sacred burial ground in all of Egypt. Every pharaoh who could afford it built a cenotaph there, a symbolic tomb near the resting place of the earliest kings. They knew, even if they did not speak their names, that the scorpions were there, watching from the sands. Today, the macehead of Scorpion II resides in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, a small object of carved limestone that contains within it the memory of a forgotten age. The tomb of Scorpion I lies open to the sky at Abydos, its chambers emptied of their treasures, the labels that bore his name now displayed in museums across the world. The Scorpion kings ruled at the dawn of history, in that misty period when the first cities rose along the Nile and the first kings struggled for supremacy. They were real men, living and dying, fighting and building, ruling and being forgotten. Their names survive only because they carved them into bone and stone, because they built tombs that would outlast their civilization, because they hoped, in some small way, to be remembered. And so they are. Not in the king lists of the pharaohs who came after. Not in the official histories carved on temple walls. But in the artifacts that archaeologists dig from the sand, in the patient work of scholars who piece together the fragments of the past, in the stories we tell ourselves about who came before and what they left behind. The Scorpion kings ruled when Egypt was becoming Egypt. They were the proto-pharaohs, the kings before the kings, the rulers who laid the foundations for the greatest civilization of the ancient world. And in the darkness of prehistory, among the scorpions and the sand, they wait for us to remember them. Sleep now, and dream of the desert, of the river, of the kings who ruled before the pharaohs. The scorpion watches from the darkness, small but deadly, waiting to be remembered. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more forgotten histories from the ancient world. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, Our community spans from Cairo to California, from history enthusiasts to Egyptologist students. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.